So how in the world does a comic book character with one of the most famously messy, contradictory backstories in all of fiction end up becoming this, like, surprisingly deep allegory for self-creation? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down today. Believe me, this isn't just about fangs and monsters. It's really about a journey of confronting trauma and building a whole new identity, literally from the ground up, out of pure chaos.
Okay, so when you look at this pile of comics, it's easy to just see a mess. And for decades, that's what Vampireless history was, kind of a running joke. But what if that mess wasn't just, a bunch of writers not talking to each other? What if it was the point? What if it was the actual central trauma of her story, a deep psychological wound carved into her very sense of self? Because really, that idea, that shift in thinking, that's the key that unlocks this entire thing.
All right, here's the game plan for how we're going to walk through this. We'll kick off with her broken history, then look at the meta-narrative cure. From there, we'll dig into the trauma of untruth, the two tyrannies she faces, her big revelation in the middle of all that chaos, and finally, how she becomes the self-begotten hero.
All right, first up, a hero's broken history. See, Vampirella's biggest enemy wasn't some supervillain. No, it was her own past. It was this story that had been told by so many different people in so many different ways that it collapsed on itself. It became a prison of contradictions.
And this right here is the heart of the problem. For years, you never knew which Vampirella you were getting. Was she a sci-fi alien, a refugee from this planet called Draculon where blood flowed like rivers? Or was she the supernatural demon, the daughter of Lilith herself? I mean, alien or demon, a space crash or a biblical curse, the story just kept flipping back and forth for decades, and it created this total instability right at the core of who she was supposed to be.
So how do you even begin to fix a mess like that? Well, that brings us to the really clever part, the meta-narrative cure. What the 2019 writers did was, frankly, brilliant. They didn't just pick one origin and throw the other out. No, they took all that chaos, all that messy history, and made it part of her story.
They pulled this off with two really smart moves. First, they said her homeworld, Draculon, wasn't just a planet, it was a whole other dimension called Arcadia. It's this kind of twilight realm where sci-fi and horror can exist at the same time. Okay, cool. But the second part? This is the absolute masterstroke. They reveal that her mother, Lilith, has this magic mirror she used to implant fake memories in Vampirella's head, so all those contradictory origin stories she's had over the years, they were all lies. Every single one of them was a fabrication, fed to her by her own mom.
Now there's a name for this trick. It's called meta-commentary. It's basically when a story becomes self-aware and starts talking about itself. And just think about it for a second. Lilith's magic mirror is the perfect in-universe explanation for a retcon, right? It's the tool that comic book writers use to change a character's history. So the story is literally pointing at its own messy, retcon past and using that to create this incredibly deep, personal conflict for Vampirella.
So this is the really big takeaway here. What used to be a flaw in the comic, just a bunch of inconsistent writing, has now been transformed into the character's central, defining trauma. It's not just a continuity problem anymore. It's a profound psychological wound, and it was inflicted on her by the one person she should have been able to trust. A bug in the story becomes her deepest source of pain.
And that wound, that leads us right into the trauma of untruth. I mean, just try to imagine that for a second. What would it actually feel like to find out that your entire past, everything you thought made you you, was a complete fabrication? This is where the story goes from being clever to being genuinely philosophical. We're about to dive into her psychological paralysis.
And there's actually a philosophical term that perfectly describes what she's going through: resentiment. It's a concept from the philosopher Nietzsche, and it's all about that deep, toxic feeling of frustration and helplessness when you can't fight back, when you can't act. For Vampirella, it's like this deep existential nausea. She has no idea who she really is, only what her mother told her she was. And that knowledge, or lack thereof, just leaves her totally and completely paralyzed.
And man, this quote from a therapy session she has just, it hits so hard. I am a walking contradiction. I cannot discern the real from the reflected image in my mother's magic mirror. Just think about that. It's not just about being confused. It's about not being able to trust a single memory that makes you who you are. The very ground beneath your feet, your entire reality has just disappeared.
And that's exactly why her therapist, who represents, modern logic and reason, can't actually do anything for her.
This isn't some simple psychological issue you can diagnose and treat. It's an existential crisis. It's a wound to her very being. And how can you possibly use logic to fix a problem that was created by the complete breakdown of logic in the first place? You just can't.
So if reason is totally off the table, what happens next? Well, her crisis gets personified. It takes the form of this massive ordeal, which brings us to the two tyrannies. She's basically forced to choose between two villains who aren't just bad guys. They represent two different ways for her entire existence to be wiped out.
Okay, so check this out. On one side, you've got this guy Vrildox. He's the architect of order, and his whole deal is forcing one single, perfect, logical reality onto everything. Then, on the other side, you have this thing called the Continuist. It's basically a demon of retcon, a demon of storytelling that wants to dissolve reality into a meaningless soup of constantly changing stories. So that's her choice, a perfectly logical frozen cage or a bottomless, chaotic void.
So this really breaks down the two philosophical nightmares she's staring down. Vrildox is offering the tyranny of the absolute, basically a universe where everything makes sense, but there's zero free will. Then the Continuist is offering the tyranny of the relative, a universe where anything can be true, which means nothing is actually true. And for someone like Vampirella, whose entire life has been a chaotic mess of lies, this Continuist is like looking into a mirror of her absolute worst fear.
So, how do you possibly get out of a choice like that? It seems impossible, right? Well, that's where we get to her big moment, revelation and chaos. Her big breakthrough, the thing that saves her, doesn't come from her finally finding the one true story. It comes from her realizing she's been asking the wrong question the whole time.
And this right here, this is the moment everything changes. She finally gets it. There is no true origin story. There's no secret truth hidden away somewhere. The chaos, the contradictions, the manipulation by her mother, that was her origin. That was the truth. And the only way she could ever move forward was to stop digging for solid ground that just didn't exist.
What she's doing here is embracing what philosophers call the Dionysian spirit. It's this idea of accepting the chaos, the contradictions, and the beautiful absurdity of life, and seeing it not as a flaw, but as a source of incredible power. And for her, this realization is the perfect antidote to that paralyzing ressentiment. It's the key that finally unlocks her cage. And once she accepts this, everything changes for her. She goes from being a victim of her story to being the creator of her future. She stops searching for facts and starts wielding her own will. All those contradictions that made her feel so broken and weak, she turns them into her greatest strength.
And all of this leads to her final, incredible transformation into what the story calls the self-begotten hero. When we see her next, she's a completely different person. She's not a character reacting to a story that's been forced on her anymore. No, now she's the author.
In fact, she ends up embodying another one of Nietzsche's big ideas, the Übermensch, or the overhuman. And that's really just a term for an individual who completely rises above what everyone else tells them they should be, and instead creates their own values and defines their own existence for themselves. She has finally achieved total psychological freedom. Think about it. She's no longer defined by Lilith's manipulations, or even by the pen of a comic book writer. The only thing that defines her now is her own powerful will to exist. She is, in the most literal sense of the word, self-begotten, self-created.
And this whole incredible journey culminates in one of the most powerful lines in the series, when she finally comes face to face with the forces of absolute order and absolute chaos. She just looks at them and says, "I am the offer, and I exist." I mean, that's it. That is the ultimate declaration of self-creation. So in the end, Vampirella's wild journey through all this philosophical chaos brings the whole thing right back home, to us. Her story is this powerful reminder that identity, it's really just a story we tell ourselves. And any story can be examined, it can be deconstructed, and most importantly, it can be rewritten. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. If your identity is a story, who's holding the pen?